Hi, I'm Natalie. 3 months ago, I stood in my in-laws' dining room with a red handprint burning across my cheek. My crime? The butternut squash soup I'd spent hours making didn't have enough salt. What they didn't know was that I held the deed to the very roof over their heads. And by the end of that night, they'd learn exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ever been treated like you're worthless by the people who should protect you, only to watch their faces change when the truth walks in? Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just silence a room, it rewrote a family.
The October rain had started early that afternoon in Portland, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but settles in like an unwanted guest planning to stay. I stood at the kitchen island of the Brennan family estate in Lake Oswego, watching steam rise from the soup pot while droplets traced paths down the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the manicured lawn stretched toward the lake, every blade of grass perfectly trimmed, every hedge sculpted into submission. Nothing here grew wild. Nothing here was allowed to be imperfect. I'd been cooking since noon. The invitation had come 3 days prior, not from Derek, my husband of 4 years, but from his mother, Patricia, in a text message that read more like a summons than a request. Family dinner Sunday at 6. We're celebrating Richard's promotion. Don't be late. No question mark, no warmth, just expectation wrapped in politeness so thin you could see straight through it. I learned early in this marriage that Patricia's invitations weren't optional. Missing one meant weeks of icy silences and pointed comments about commitment and family values. So I'd gone to the farmer's market that morning, picked out the best butternut squash I could find, the kind with deep orange flesh that promised sweetness. I'd roasted it slowly with shallots and fresh thyme from my own small garden, the one Derek said was a waste of time because we could just buy herbs at the store. The soup simmered now, velvety and golden. I'd tasted it twice, adjusted the pepper, added a whisper of nutmeg. It was good, more than good. But I knew from experience that good was rarely good enough in this house. Derek wandered in around 5:30, still in his golf clothes, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and autumn air. He glanced at the pot without really seeing it, then checked his phone. His father just texted. They're running 10 minutes behind. You almost ready? I nodded, wiping down the counter one more time. The kitchen here was 3 times the size of our entire apartment in the Alberta Arts District, all marble and stainless steel lights, and pendant lights that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Patricia had made it clear when Derek and I got engaged that we'd be expected at the estate regularly. After all, she'd said with that smile that never reached her eyes, family is everything. What she really meant was control is everything. By 6:15, we were all seated around the long dining table. Richard sat at the head, freshly showered and wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost what I used to make in a month. Patricia was to his right, her blonde hair styled in that ageless way wealthy women perfect, not a strand out of place. Vanessa, Derek's older sister, sat across from us with her husband Trevor, both of them dressed like they'd just stepped out of a country club catalog. And then there was Cole, Derek's younger brother, perpetually single and perpetually smug, already on his second glass of wine before the first course. I'd set out the soup in Patricia's good china, the Wedgwood she only used for important occasions. Each bowl was filled carefully, garnished with a drizzle of cream and a few toasted pumpkin seeds. It looked beautiful. Restaurant quality. I'd made sure of that. The conversation started with Richard's promotion, something about a corner office and a new title that came with even more authority at the investment firm where he'd worked for 30 years. Patricia beamed as he told the story, her hand resting on his arm in that proprietary way she had, as if his success was somehow her achievement too. Then we began to eat. I watched as Patricia lifted her spoon, brought it to her lips, and paused. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around her mouth. She set the spoon down slowly, deliberately, and reached for her water glass. Richard tried his next, and I saw the same flicker cross his face. Vanessa glanced between them, confused, then tasted her own soup. Cole kept eating, oblivious as always. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly, like cold air through a cracked window. Derek cleared his throat, a sound I'd learned meant trouble was coming. Patricia dabbed her lips with the napkin, set it down, and looked directly at me. Her voice when she spoke was measured, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "Natalie, darling, did you forget something?" I felt my chest tighten. Forget what? The salt. There's no salt in this soup. I'd seasoned it. I knew I had. I'd tasted it multiple times, adjusted it, made sure it was balanced. But looking around the table now, seeing the way they were all watching me, I suddenly doubted myself. I must have tasted it wrong. "I'm sorry, I can fix it." Patricia's laugh was soft, almost musical. "It's fine, dear. It's just that when you're cooking for others, you really should be more careful. Attention to detail matters." Richard nodded slowly as if she'd said something profound. "It's the little things that show respect, Natalie." Vanessa added her voice, syrupy and false. "Maybe cooking just isn't your strong suit. Not everyone has the touch for it." I felt Derek stiffen beside me, but he didn't speak. He never spoke. Not when his mother made comments about my clothes being too casual for family gatherings. Not when his father asked repeatedly when we'd be moving to a better neighborhood. Not when Vanessa suggested I'd trapped Derek into marriage because I came from nothing. Heat crawled up my neck, but I kept my voice steady. "I can get the salt. It'll just take a second." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Don't bother. We'll just make do. It's not like this is a restaurant." But there was something in her tone, something sharp beneath the sweetness that made my hands curl into fists under the table. I glanced at Derek, hoping for even a small gesture of support, but he was staring at his bowl like it held the secrets of the universe. Cole, ever the instigator, leaned back in his chair. "You know what Mom always says, if you can't handle the small things, how can anyone trust you with the big ones?" That's when Patricia stood. She walked slowly around the table, her heels clicking against the hardwood with each deliberate step. When she reached my chair, she stopped, and I felt the weight of her presence like a shadow falling across sunlight. I looked up at her confused, waiting for whatever cutting remark would come next. Instead, her hand came across my face so fast I barely registered the movement before the sting bloomed across my cheek. The slap wasn't hard enough to knock me sideways, but it was loud. The sound cracked through the dining room like a branch snapping, and for a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My hand went to my face instinctively, feeling the heat spreading under my palm. I stared at Patricia, who stood there with her hand still raised slightly, her expression almost serene. "Maybe that will help you remember next time. Details matter. In this family, we don't accept carelessness." I couldn't speak. The words tangled in my throat, caught between shock and something darker, something that tasted like years of swallowed insults finally reaching their limit. Derek shifted in his seat. "Mom, that's maybe a little much." A little much. Not wrong, not unacceptable, just a little much. Patricia returned to her seat, smoothing her skirt as if nothing had happened. She picked up her wine glass and took a delicate sip. "No," she said brightly, as if we'd just been discussing the weather. "Shall we talk about Thanksgiving plans?" The conversation resumed around me like water flowing around a stone. Vanessa asked about the menu. Cole mentions he might bring someone this year. Richard suggested they rent a cabin in Bend for the long weekend. And I sat there, my cheeks still burning, my soup growing cold in front of me, and felt something inside me shift. Not break. Shift. Like a lock turning, tumblers falling into place. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. The sound made everyone look up. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "I need some air." Derek reached for my arm, but I pulled away gently. I walked out of the dining room, through the grand foyer with its crystal chandelier and imported tile, and out the front door, into the rain. The cold hit my face like a baptism. I stood on the circular driveway, letting the water soak through my sweater, and pulled out my phone from my pocket. My hands were steadier than I expected as I scrolled through my contacts and found the name I needed. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered, crisp and professional, even at this hour. Iris Chen speaking. Iris, I said, my voice calm despite the rain, despite everything. It's Natalie. I need you to pull the Lake Oswego file. There was a pause, then I heard the smile in her voice. Are you sure? I looked back at the house, at the warm light glowing from the windows, at the perfect picture of family and success that hid so much ugliness underneath. I'm sure. It's time they knew. I'll have everything ready by morning. I hung up and stood there a moment longer, feeling the rain wash away the sting on my cheek, wash away 4 years of biting my tongue and making myself smaller. Then I walked back inside, water dripping onto that expensive tile, and returned to the dining room. They were still eating, still talking, barely acknowledging my return. I didn't sit back down. I stood at the edge of the table and waited until Patricia finally looked up, annoyance flickering across her perfect features. Yes, Natalie? I smiled, not the tight, nervous smile I usually wore in this house, but something genuine.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Something that came from a place they'd never seen. I just wanted to let you know, I said quietly, that I'll be taking care of the property taxes this year. Since I own the house now, it only seems right. The room went still. Not the polite stillness of before, but something absolute. Like all the air had been sucked out through the windows. Patricia's fork clattered against her plate. What did you say? The taxes on this property. I'll handle them, along with the insurance and the maintenance fees. It's a big responsibility, but I think I can manage. After all, I managed to buy it without anyone noticing. Richard's face had gone pale. That's not funny, Natalie. I wasn't joking. I looked at Derek, who was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You never asked about my grandmother Helen, did you? Any of you? You just assumed I came from nothing because I didn't flash money around, because I lived simply. Vanessa found her voice first, sharp and defensive. What are you talking about? My grandmother was Helen Worth. You might recognize the name if you paid attention to anything outside this bubble. She held patents on medical diagnostic equipment that's used in hospitals worldwide. When she died 2 years ago, she left everything to me. Not in a trust, not with conditions, just left it all to the granddaughter she raised while everyone else was too busy to notice a quiet kid who liked to read. The numbers didn't matter right now, but I knew them by heart. The patent royalties alone brought in more annually than Richard made at his corner office. The property investments my grandmother had made over 40 years had multiplied into a portfolio that spanned 3 states. And 6 months ago, when this estate went into quiet foreclosure because Richard's firm was investigated for fraud, because his assets were frozen and his credit destroyed, I'd bought it through a holding company. They never knew. The paperwork had been handled by lawyers and shell companies with names that meant nothing. The Brennan family stayed in their home, paying rent to an entity they never connected to the quiet daughter-in-law they treated like help. Patricia stood, her chair scraping loudly. This is absurd. Richard, tell her this is absurd. But Richard wasn't speaking. He was staring at me with something I'd never seen before in his eyes. Fear. Cole's smug expression had evaporated. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed without sound. And Derek, my husband, who'd sat silent while his mother struck me, was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The salt was fine, by the way. I checked it 3 times. But thank you for the reminder about attention to detail. I've been paying very close attention. To everything. I turned and walked toward the door, my wet shoes squeaking slightly on the floor. Behind me, I heard Patricia's voice, shrill now, stripped of its practiced refinement. Natalie, you get back here right now. We need to discuss this. But I was already gone. Already pulling my keys from my purse, already feeling the rain on my face again as I crossed to my car. Through the window, I could see them all standing now, gathered in the dining room like actors who'd forgotten their lines. I drove away slowly, watching the estate shrink in my rearview mirror. The soup bowls would still be sitting on that table,
cooling in the silence I'd left behind. And tomorrow, when the sun came up, they'd start to understand just how much had changed. But tonight, I drove through the rain toward my small apartment in the Alberta Arts District, where my grandmother's recipe box sat on a shelf next to her fountain pen, where nothing was perfect, but everything was mine, and where I could finally breathe without weighing every word first. The real withdrawal wasn't the property. It was my silence, my tolerance, my willingness to be small so they could feel big, and I wasn't getting any of it back. The apartment felt different when I walked in that night. Smaller, maybe, or perhaps just more honest. Rain dripped from my coat onto the hardwood floor as I hung it by the door, leaving a dark puddle that I didn't bother to wipe up. The space smelled like the lavender candle I'd left burning on the kitchen counter, mixed with old books and the faint mustiness that came with a building constructed in 1924. Nothing matched here. The couch was secondhand, reupholstered in a fabric I'd chosen myself. The coffee table belonged to my grandmother, scarred from years of use, but solid. The art on the walls came from local artists whose work I'd bought at street fairs, not because it would impress anyone, but because it moved something in me. This was mine. Every imperfect inch of it. I peeled off my wet clothes and changed into flannel pajama pants and an old university sweatshirt, the kind with frayed cuffs and a logo so faded you could barely read it. Then I made tea. Not the expensive, loose-leaf kind Patricia served and her Wedgwood, just regular black tea from a box, steeped strong enough to taste like comfort. My phone had been vibrating in my purse since I left Lake Oswego. I'd ignored it during the drive, focused on the rhythm of the windshield wipers and the red glow of taillights ahead of me. Now, sitting cross-legged on my couch with steam rising from my mug, I finally pulled it out. 17 missed calls, 12 text messages, 3 voicemails. Derek had called 9 times. The text from him started apologetic, progressed to confused, then landed on defensive. "We need to talk about what you said tonight. That wasn't fair, springing that on everyone. Call me back. Mom is really upset." Mom is really upset. Not you were assaulted, not I should have defended you, just concern for his mother's feelings as always. Patricia had left a voicemail. I played it on speaker, her voice filling my small living room with that particular blend of sweetness and steel she'd perfected over decades. "Natalie, darling, I think we all got a bit overwrought tonight. These things happen in families. Why don't you come by tomorrow and we can discuss this calmly? Just as women. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding about the property situation. We can clear it all up over coffee." She actually thought I'd show up for coffee. Like we were gonna laugh about this over scones and pretend her hand had connected with my face. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the others. Instead, I opened my laptop, the one I'd bought with my first royalty check 5 years ago when I was still trying to figure out what having money meant. The screen glowed to life, casting blue light across the dim room. I navigated through password-protected folders until I found what I needed.
Property documents, patent portfolios, investment statements, legal correspondence. Everything organized with the kind of careful attention to detail Patricia claimed I lacked. My grandmother had taught me that. Helen Worth, who'd grown up during the Depression and never forgot what it meant to have nothing. She'd worked as a lab technician in the 50s, back when women in science were secretaries with better job titles. But she'd been brilliant, the kind of brilliant that doesn't need permission or degrees to see solutions others missed. When the lead researcher on her team was developing new X-ray imaging technology, she'd quietly improved the calibration system, making it accurate enough to detect fractures conventional machines missed. He'd wanted to take full credit. She'd insisted on being listed as co-inventor or she'd walk. In 1958, that kind of demand from a woman could end a career. But she'd had documentation, notebooks full of calculations and iterations, proof that couldn't be dismissed. They'd compromised. Her name went on the patent application in small print. Easy to overlook. But legally, she owned half. That technology became the standard in emergency rooms across the country. The royalties started small, just enough to buy a house and save for retirement. But over decades, as hospitals expanded and updated their equipment, the numbers grew. She'd invested carefully,
bought property when Portland was still affordable, and watched the city transform around her holdings. She never told anyone, not her friends, not her neighbors, not even her daughter, my mother, who died when I was 6 in a car accident that left me with barely any memories except the smell of her perfume and the sound of her laugh. Helen had raised me after that, in the same small house she'd bought in the 60s, teaching me to mend clothes instead of buying new ones, to cook from scratch, to understand that wealth wasn't about display. When I was 16 and filling out college applications, she'd sat me down at her kitchen table and opened a folder. Inside were account statements that made my eyes go wide. "I don't want you to tell anyone about this," she'd said, her voice firm but kind. "Not your friends, not boys you date, not employers. Money changes how people see you, and not usually for the better. You need to know who cares about you before they know what you have." I'd kept that secret. Through college, through meeting Derek at a mutual friend's barbecue, through our courtship and engagement. He'd thought I worked in medical research because I was passionate about it, not because I already understood patents and licensing from growing up around my grandmother's work. His family had assumed I was poor because I didn't wear designer labels or drive a new car. I'd never corrected them. I'd wanted to see who they really were when they thought I had nothing. Turned out they were exactly who they appeared to be. Helen had died 2 years ago, quietly in her sleep at 89. The funeral had been small because she'd outlived most of her generation and preferred a handful of real friends to a crowd of acquaintances. Derek's family hadn't come. They'd sent flowers with a card signed by Patricia's assistant. At the time, I'd told myself it was fine, that they barely knew her. Now I understood they hadn't come because my grandmother wasn't impressive enough. No corner office, no country club membership, just an old woman who'd lived simply in an old house. Not worth their time. The inheritance had been structured carefully. Helen had worked with lawyers who understood discretion, who knew how to build walls between assets and identity. The property holdings were under an LLC called Cascade Properties. The patent royalties flowed through a trust named after a mountain she'd loved hiking. Even the tax documents were routed through accounting firms that specialized in privacy. When Richard Brennan's investment firm had been investigated 8 months ago, I'd been as shocked as anyone. The news had broken on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents walking into his office building, boxes of documents carried out on camera. The investigation centered on insider trading and misappropriation of client funds, white-collar crimes with serious consequences. Richard had maintained his innocence publicly, hired expensive lawyers, and waited. The firm had survived, technically. No criminal charges were filed after months of scrutiny. But the damage was done. Clients left, assets were frozen during the investigation, and the personal loans Richard had taken against his reputation came due all at once, including the second mortgage on the Lake Oswego estate, the one he needed to maintain appearances when his commissions dried up. The foreclosure notice had been filed quietly. These things usually were when wealthy people were involved. The bank that held the note wanted to avoid publicity as much as the Brennans did. They'd listed it for private sale, no public auction, no newspaper announcements, just discreet conversations with qualified buyers who could close quickly. I'd learned about it from Iris Chen, who managed some of my property investments and had eyes on opportunities across the region. She'd sent me the listing with a short message. "This might interest you. Familiar address." I'd sat with that information for 2 days, turning it over in my mind like a stone. Part of me wanted to let it go, to let Richard's pride take the hit it deserved, and watch from the distance as they downsized into something more appropriate for their actual financial situation. But another part of me, the part that remembered every dismissive comment and pitying look, saw something else. An opportunity, not for revenge, but for truth. I'd made the offer through Cascade Properties. All cash, quick close, current tenants could remain under a lease agreement if desired. The bank had accepted within a week. The Brennans never knew the property had changed hands. They'd received notice that their foreclosure had been resolved by a private investment group, that they could stay in the home under a lease-to-own arrangement if they wished, that their monthly payments would actually be lower than before. Richard had taken credit for negotiating the deal. I'd heard about it third hand through Derek's casual mention that his father had really worked magic with the bank.
Patricia had thrown a small party to celebrate, inviting friends over to demonstrate that nothing had really changed. They were still the Brennans of Lake Oswego, still in their beautiful home. I'd attended that party. I'd brought wine and smiled politely while Patricia accepted congratulations for her husband's financial acumen. Nobody had thought to thank the investment group that had actually saved them. Nobody had wondered who was behind it. Now, sitting in my apartment with rain pattering against the windows, I pulled up the lease agreement. It was standard, professionally written, with all the protections a landlord would want. But there was a clause I'd insisted on, buried in the middle of page 7. In the event of physical assault or harassment of any party by the tenants, the lease may be terminated with 30 days' notice and no penalty to the property owner. My lawyer had questioned it at the time. This is pretty specific, Natalie. Are you anticipating a problem? Just covering all bases, I said. I composed an email to Iris, keeping it brief. Please begin the 30-day termination process for the Lake Oswego property. Lease violation, clause 7.3. Let me know what documentation you need. Her response came back in under 5 minutes despite the late hour. Iris never seemed to sleep. Documentation received via your earlier message. Will notify tenants tomorrow morning via certified mail. You want to pursue damages? I considered it. I could. The clause allowed for it, but that wasn't the point. No damages, just termination and return of property. Keep it clean. Understood. And Natalie, about time. I closed the laptop and sat back against the couch cushions, feeling something release in my chest that had been tight for so long I'd forgotten what breathing fully felt like. My phone buzzed again. Derek, still calling. I sent it to voicemail and instead opened my photo album, scrolling back through years of images until I found what I was looking for. A picture from my wedding day. Not one of the professional shots, but a candid someone had caught when they thought no one was performing. I was standing alone near the venue's garden, holding my bouquet and looking out at nothing in particular. My expression was hard to read, something between hope and hesitation. Derek was visible in the background, laughing with his groomsmen, not noticing I'd stepped away. I'd wanted so badly to belong to something that day, to have a family again after losing my grandmother, to believe that Derek's love was strong enough to include me in the tight circle the Brennans had drawn around themselves. I'd convinced myself that if I was patient enough, kind enough, small enough, they'd eventually make room. 4 years. That's how long it had taken to understand they'd never intended to make room. I was an accessory to them, something Derek had chosen that reflected poorly on his judgment, a reminder that their son had married down, despite all their efforts to steer him towards someone more suitable. Vanessa had introduced Derek to plenty of appropriate women over the years. I'd heard the stories, passed around like family lore, beautiful women with the right pedigrees, daughters of Richard's colleagues and Patricia's friends, but Derek had chosen me instead. Met me at that barbecue where I'd been wearing jeans with paint stands from helping a friend move, where I'd made him laugh with a story about my grandmother accidentally flooding her basement while trying to fix the water heater herself. He liked that I was different, that I didn't care about the things his family obsessed over, that I made him feel like he could be himself instead of the heir to Brennan expectations. But the problem with wanting someone because they're different is that eventually your family notices the difference too. And Derek, for all his initial rebellious attraction, wasn't strong enough to choose me over them when it mattered. The slap had clarified that. Not just Patricia's action, but Derek's inaction. His half-hearted, "that's maybe a little much," delivered only after the handprint was already blooming on my skin. He'd sat there and let his mother strike me over soup, over salt, over nothing that actually mattered. Some betrayals are loud. They shout and shatter and leave obvious wreckage. But some are quiet, almost polite. They happen in the space where words should be but aren't, in the defense that never comes, in the silence that says you're not worth the discomfort of confrontation. Derek's betrayal had been building for years in those small silences. Every time Patricia made a cutting remark and he changed the subject instead of speaking up. Every time Richard questioned my background and he laughed it off instead of shutting it down. Every time Vanessa suggested I wasn't quite suitable and he shrugged like it was just his sister being his sister.
like her contempt was something I should tolerate because that's what family does. Except I wasn't family to them. I'd never been family. I was the woman their son had married despite their preferences, and they'd been waiting for 4 years for him to see his mistake. My phone buzzed with a text. Not Derek this time, but Cole. The message was short, almost nervous. "Did you really buy the house? Dad is losing it." I didn't respond. Let them spiral. Let them check property records and call lawyers and try to figure out when this happened and how they'd missed it. Let them feel for one night what I'd felt for 4 years. Off balance, uncertain, not quite sure where solid ground was anymore. Tomorrow they'd get the certified letter. Tomorrow this would become real in a way that required lawyers and moving companies and explanations to friends about why the Brennans were leaving Lake Oswego. Tomorrow, Patricia would have to face the fact that the daughter-in-law she'd struck had been paying her mortgage for months. But tonight, I finished my tea and pulled my grandmother's old recipe box down from the shelf. It was wooden, worn smooth at the corners from decades of use, with a hand-painted flower on the lid that had faded to ghost colors. Inside were index cards covered in Helen's neat handwriting, recipes for pot roast and apple pie and butternut squash soup. I pulled out the soup card, reading the notes she'd written in the margins over the years. More nutmeg in October. Fresh thyme is best, but dried works. Salt to taste. But remember, salt enhances. It doesn't replace flavor. Salt to taste. I'd done exactly that. The soup was properly seasoned. Patricia had lied, creating a problem where none existed so she could demonstrate her authority, so she could remind me that in her home, under her rules, I would never measure up. But it wasn't her home. Not anymore. And I was done measuring myself against standards designed to ensure I'd always fall short. I put the recipe card back carefully, closed the box, and set it on the shelf next to the fountain pen Helen had used to sign all those patents. Tomorrow would bring chaos. Tomorrow would bring demands and accusations and probably threats from expensive lawyers. Tomorrow, Derek would have to choose whether he was my husband or their son. And I already knew which he'd pick because he'd been picking it for years. But tonight, I sat in my small apartment with my mismatched furniture and my street fair art, drinking tea from a chipped mug, and felt more at home than I ever had in that perfect estate with its perfect lawn and perfect facade hiding all the imperfect cruelty underneath. The rain had stopped sometime when I wasn't paying attention. Through the window, Portland's lights spread out across the hills, thousands of lives being lived in thousands of different ways, most of them far from perfect, most of them real. I turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the buildings settle around me, feeling the weight of what I'd set in motion and finding it lighter than I'd expected. Easier to carry than silence had been. Easier to hold than the pretense that things were fine when they never had been. Somewhere across the city, in a house that would soon no longer be theirs, the Brennan family was probably still gathered around that dining table, probably still trying to understand what had happened, probably still convinced there was some way to undo it. There wasn't. Some things once spoken couldn't be unspoken. Some truths once revealed changed everything. And some silences once broken echoed louder than any words that had come before. I'd been so quiet for so long, careful, accommodating, trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely. Now I was done trying, done earning, done pretending that their version of family was something worth belonging to. Tomorrow I'd start building something different, something honest, something mine. But tonight, I just sat in the dark and breathed, finally, without weighing every breath first. The certified letter arrived at the Lake Oswego estate at 9:43 the next morning. I knew the exact time because Iris texted me a delivery confirmation with a timestamp. Professional courtesy terminated due to lease violation, per Clause 7.3. Vacate premises within 30 days. All standard language, nothing personal, just legal terminology that meant their world was about to collapse in a very specific timeline. I was at my desk in the Alberta Arts District when the notification came through, surrounded by patent documentation I'd been reviewing for a medical equipment manufacturer who wanted to license one of Helen's designs for their new portable imaging system. The numbers were good, the terms fair, and I'd probably sign off by end of week.
Normal Tuesday morning work, the kind that paid my bills and funded the life I'd built quietly while everyone assumed I was barely scraping by. My phone started ringing at 10:15. Derek, of course. I let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately, then again. On the fourth attempt, I answered, putting him on speaker while I continued reading through the licensing agreement. "Natalie, what the hell is going on?" His voice was tight, strained in a way I'd rarely heard. "Mom just got some letters saying we have to leave the house. This has to be a mistake." "It's not a mistake." "What are you talking about? This is from some property company. Cascade something. They're saying we violated our lease. We don't even have a lease. We own this house." I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the street below where morning traffic moved slowly through light rain. "You don't own it, Derek. You haven't owned it for 8 months. Your parents were in foreclosure. Cascade Properties bought it to keep the bank from auctioning it off publicly." There was a long silence on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower. "And Cascade Properties is mine. Well, technically, it's an LLC, but I'm the sole owner. I bought your family home last February." Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear voices in the background, Patricia's rising pitch, Richard's deeper rumble. They were all there, probably gathered in that perfect living room, probably staring at the letter like it was written in a foreign language. "This is insane," Derek finally said. "You can't just kick us out of our own home." "It's not your home. And I'm not kicking you out over nothing. Your mother assaulted me last night at dinner. That violates the lease agreement. The one your father signed without reading carefully because he was too relieved someone had bailed him out to ask questions." "That wasn't assault, Natalie. She was upset. You embarrassed her." "She hit me across the face because soup didn't have enough salt, which it did, by the way. I seasoned it properly. She just needed an excuse to remind me I don't belong." Derek's voice shifted, taking on that placating tone he used when he wanted to smooth things over without actually addressing the problem. "Look, I know Mom can be difficult, but don't you think this is a bit extreme? Kicking my whole family out because of one incident? One incident. Like the years of small cruelties didn't count. Like every dismissive comment and pitying look and subtle suggestion that I wasn't good enough just evaporated because they happened in private. Happened quietly. Happened in ways that were easy to ignore if you wanted to." "It's not about one incident," I said. "It's about finally having a boundary that actually means something. Your mother crossed it. Now there are consequences." I heard Patricia in the background, her voice sharp. "Let me talk to her. Give me the phone." A rustling sound, then Patricia's voice came through. No longer sweet, no longer performing warmth. "Natalie, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but this is childish, absolutely childish. You're upset about last night. Fine, I apologize. There. Now drop this nonsense and we can all move forward like adults." The apology hung in the air between us, hollow and obligatory. Sorry as a chess move, not sorry as actual remorse. "I appreciate the apology," I said, keeping my voice even. "But it doesn't change anything. You have 30 days to find other accommodations. The lease termination stands." "You can't do this." Her voice was rising now, control slipping. "You can't just throw us out on the street. Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation? What people will think?" And there it was. Not concern for where they'd live or how they'd manage, but what people would think. The same concern that had driven every decision this family made. The same obsession with appearance over substance that had made my life with them unbearable. "I imagine people will think what they always think when someone loses their home," I said. "That there are consequences for poor financial decisions and treating people badly. Richard, I could hear your firm is still under investigation. You might want to focus on that instead of calling me names." "We are not losing this house," Patricia said, her words clipped and precise. "We'll fight this. We have lawyers. Good ones." "Go ahead. The lease agreement is ironclad. Your husband signed it. His signature is notarized. And I have documentation of last night's incident. Multiple witnesses saw what happened, even if they pretended not to." "Those witnesses are family, Natalie. They're not going to testify against Patricia."
I'm not asking them to testify. I'm just letting you know that what happened wasn't private, wasn't invisible, and wasn't acceptable. You spent 4 years treating me like I should be grateful you let me sit at your table. Now you can spend the next 30 days figuring out where you're going to sit instead. I heard Richard's voice again, closer now, like he had taken the phone. Natalie, let's be reasonable here. You're angry, that's understandable, but eviction over a family disagreement? That's not proportional. You're right, I said. It's not proportional to last night, but it is proportional to 4 years of being treated like I'm not good enough, not smart enough, not wealthy enough to be part of this family. To being dismissed and belittled and tolerated instead of respected. Last night was just the moment I decided I was done accepting it. There was a muffled conversation on their end, voices overlapping in what sounded like argument. Then Derek came back on, and his tone had shifted into something I recognized. The voice he used when he was trying to negotiate, trying to find the angle that would get him what he wanted. Okay, he said. I hear you. I understand you're hurt. But think about this practically. Where are my parents supposed to go on such short notice? They're in their 60s. This is their home. Can't we work something out? Maybe extend the deadline, give them time to figure things out? They have 30 days. That's more time than your mother gave me to decide whether slapping was something I should just accept. Jesus Christ, Natalie, it was one slap, one time. You're acting like she beat you bloody. And you're acting like any amount of hitting is acceptable as long as it doesn't leave permanent marks. That tells me everything I need to know about where you stand. His frustration was audible now. Where I stand? I'm trying to find a solution here. I'm trying to help both of you. No, you're trying to make this go away so you don't have to choose. But it's too late, Derek. I'm not making you choose. I already know what you'd pick. I've known for years. Last night just made it obvious enough that I couldn't pretend anymore. So what? You're leaving me? Over this? The question almost made me laugh, but not quite. It landed somewhere closer to sad. The realization that he still didn't understand what this was about, that he thought property and marriage were separate issues, that he could keep me as a wife while his family treated me as less than. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I know I'm not going to spend another holiday at that house watching my mother orchestrate my humiliation while you pretend not to notice. I'm not going to stand in that kitchen cooking meals that will be criticized no matter how good they are. And I know I'm done trying to earn approval from people who decided years ago I wasn't worthy of it. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Vanessa's voice cut through, sharp and accusatory. You planned this, didn't you? You've been planning this for months. Buying the house, waiting for an excuse to use it against us, this whole thing was calculated. I considered that. Was it calculated? I'd bought the property to keep them from losing it publicly, to spare Derek's the embarrassment of his father's financial collapse becoming neighborhood gossip. I'd kept quiet about owning it because they'd never asked, never wondered who their mysterious benefactor was, too relieved to question their good fortune. And I'd included that clause in the lease agreement because I'd learned over 4 years that people who treated you once badly would do it again if you let them. If being prepared for consequences is calculation, then yes, I said. I calculated that someday your family's cruelty would cross a line I couldn't ignore.
Congratulations on being right on schedule. You vindictive little snake, Vanessa hissed. You came into this family with nothing. Nothing. Derek gave you everything, a name, respectability, connections. And this is how you repay him? By destroying his parents? I didn't destroy anything. Your father's poor decisions and frozen assets did that. I just stopped subsidizing the illusion that everything was fine. Cole's voice joined in, younger and angrier. So, you're rich? That whole time you were pretending to be some struggling research assistant, you were secretly loaded? That's messed up, Natalie. That's lying. I never lied about anything. I just didn't advertise information you never asked about. You all assumed I was poor because I didn't perform wealth the way you do, because I drove an old car and wore thrift store clothes and didn't name drop about vacations. That says more about your values than mine. Richard came back on, and his voice had taken on the authoritative tone he probably used with junior employees. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to get our lawyers involved. We're going to challenge this lease, and we're going to prove it was signed under duress. When my firm is cleared, and it will be, we'll have the resources to fight this properly. You might want to reconsider your position before this gets ugly. It's already ugly, Richard. It's been ugly. You just didn't notice because you weren't the one being treated like garbage in your own family. We welcomed you, Patricia interjected, her voice shaking with either rage or tears. Hard to tell. We included you in everything. And this is the thanks we get? You tolerated me, I corrected. You included me because Derek insisted, and you made sure I knew every single time that I wasn't really welcome, that I was an obligation, not a choice, a disappointment, not a daughter. The conversation was spiraling now, multiple voices talking over each other, accusations flying in directions that would solve nothing. I could hear the panic underneath their anger, the reality sinking in that this wasn't a negotiation they could win with the right words or the right pressure. I'm done with this conversation, I said, cutting through the noise. You have my lawyer's contact information in the letter. Any further communication should go through her. And Derek, I'll be staying somewhere else for a while. We can talk when you're ready to actually talk, not just when you need something from me. Natalie, wait! Derek started, but I'd already ended the call. The silence in my office felt thick after all those voices, heavy with the weight of what I'd just done. Not just terminated a lease, severed ties, drew a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made real what had been theory up until the moment that letter arrived. My hands were steady as I picked up my pen and went back to the licensing agreement. The words swam a little at first, my mind still in that conversation, still hearing Patricia's voice and Vanessa's accusations and Derek's frustrated attempts to find middle ground where none existed. But after a few minutes, the words came back into focus. The terms were clear, the timeline reasonable. This was work I understood. Transactions built on mutual benefit and clear documentation. Nothing hidden, nothing assumed. Just agreements in black and white that both parties entered willingly. My phone buzzed with texts throughout the afternoon. Derek, mostly, trying different approaches. Anger, then pleading, then logic, then guilt. He cycled through them like someone working their way through a manual on how to change someone's mind, never quite understanding that my mind wasn't the problem. My silence had been the problem, my acceptance, my willingness to shrink myself into spaces that were never big enough to hold me properly. Iris called around 3. Just wanted to check in. The Brennan's lawyer already reached out. Very aggressive, very confident they can fight this. Should I be worried? No, I said, signing off on the licensing agreement and setting it aside. The lease is solid. Their lawyer will realize that once they actually read it instead of just threatening. Let them waste their retainer if they want to. You doing okay? This is a lot to handle in 24 hours. I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than fine. I feel like I can breathe properly for the first time in years. She laughed, a warm sound that made my chest loosen a little more. That's what happens when you stop living in someone else's house, metaphorically speaking. You ready for what comes next? What comes next? The part where you build something new, the part where you stop hiding what you're capable of because you're afraid it'll intimidate people, the part where you show up as yourself. I looked around my small office, at the mismatched furniture and the plants on the windowsill that I'd managed to keep alive despite forgetting to water them half the time, at the framed photo of Helen on my desk, taken on her 80th birthday, grinning at the camera with dirt under her fingernails from the garden she refused to hire anyone to maintain. I think I'm ready, I said. Good, because I have some opportunities I want to run by you, projects that could use someone with your particular background and resources. But only if you're interested in being visible, no more hiding behind LLCs and anonymous investments. The old me would have hesitated, would have worried about what Derek would think, what his family would say, how it would look if people knew I had money. But the old me had been slapped across the face for making soup and had stood up from that table instead of apologizing for bleeding. Send me the details, I said. I'll take a look. After we hung up, I packed up my work and left the office earlier than usual. The rain had cleared, leaving everything sharp-edged and clean, the kind of afternoon where Portland showed you why people put up with 9 months of gray. I drove not toward my apartment, but toward Forest Park, parking at one of the trailheads and starting up a path Helen and I used to walk when I was younger. The woods smelled like wet earth and cedar, sounds muffled by the canopy overhead. I walked without purpose, just moving, letting my legs carry me uphill while my mind processed everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. I'd burnt it down.
The careful structure I'd built around Derek's family, the performance of being less than I was, the hope that someday they'd see me clearly. All of it gone in one dinner, one slap, one moment of finally saying, enough. The consequences would keep coming. Derek would have to choose, really choose, whether he wanted to be married to someone his family hated or wanted to maintain his position as the dutiful son. Richard would fight the lease termination and lose, and that loss would cost him more than just the house. Patricia would have to explain to her friends why they were suddenly moving, why the daughter-in-law they'd dismissed had turned out to own their home, why appearances they'd maintained so carefully were crumbling in public. And I would have to figure out who I was when I wasn't trying to fit into spaces designed to exclude me, when I wasn't making myself smaller, quieter, less threatening, when I could just be the person Helen had raised me to be, the one who understood both science and finance, who could cook soup from scratch and negotiate licensing deals, who didn't need anyone's approval to know her own worth. The trail opened onto a viewpoint overlooking the city, downtown's buildings catching late afternoon light against darker hills beyond. From up here, Lake Oswego was just one neighborhood among many. The Brennan estate was invisible in the distance, not special, not significant, just another house where people lived and heard each other and called it family. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Derek or any of the Brennans. It was a number I didn't recognize, local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Hello? Natalie Brennan? This is Margaret Hollis. I'm the managing editor at Portland Business Journal. I was calling because we received some interesting information about recent property transactions in Lake Oswego, and your name came up as being connected to Cascade Properties. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions.
My first instinct was to say no, to protect my privacy the way Helen had taught me, to keep the walls between my public and private life firmly in place. But then I remembered what Iris had said. The part where you stop hiding. What kind of questions? I asked. Well, we're doing a piece on women in property investment, particularly women who are operating under the radar in markets typically dominated by men. Your name appeared in connection with several significant acquisitions over the past few years, but there's almost no public information about you. I'm curious about your story. I looked out at the city, at all those lives being lived in all those different ways, and made a choice. Not for revenge, not to hurt the Brennans, though it probably would, but because I was tired of being invisible, tired of letting other people's comfort dictate my presence. I have some time this week, I said. Let's talk. After I hung up, I stood at that viewpoint a while longer, watching the light change, watching the city transform from day to evening, watching the world keep turning regardless of what had happened in one dining room, in one house, in one family that thought they were more important than they were. Tomorrow, the Brennans would wake up in a home they no longer owned, facing a deadline they couldn't negotiate away, dealing with consequences they'd never imagined when Patricia raised her hand across that table. Tomorrow, Derek would have to decide what kind of husband he wanted to be. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out what came next. But tonight, I just stood in the woods and breathed clean air and felt the solid ground under my feet and knew that whatever happened next, I'd handle it. Not because I was stronger than them, not because I had more money or better lawyers or some elaborate revenge planned, just because I'd finally remembered who I was before they convinced me I was less. And that person, it turned out, didn't need their approval to exist. Didn't need their acceptance to have value, didn't need their love to be whole. I just needed to stop apologizing for taking up space I'd burned. The walk back down was easier than the climb up. It usually is. The Portland Business Journal article ran on Thursday morning, 3 days after the certified letter arrived at Lake Oswego. Margaret Hollis had been thorough, interviewing not just me, but also pulling public records on Cascade Properties acquisitions over the past 5 years. The headline read, "Women in Property Investment, How Natalie Brennan Built a Quiet Empire While Everyone Was Looking Elsewhere." The photo they'd chosen showed me in my office, leaning against the desk with Helen's picture visible in the background. I looked composed in it, professional, nothing like the woman who'd stood in that dining room with a handprint on her face less than a week ago. The article detailed my holdings, the patent royalties, Helen's legacy, and yes, the Lake Oswego property.
They'd been careful with the family angle, mentioning only that I was married to the former owner's son and that the property was currently in lease termination proceedings. By noon, my phone had 17 voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, mostly. A few real estate investors wanting to discuss opportunities. 2 women from a property management consortium asking if I'd speak at their annual conference. And one message from Derek that was just breathing, like he'd called, and then couldn't figure out what to say.
I was meeting Iris for lunch at a small Vietnamese place in Southeast Portland when Vanessa found me. She must have been tracking my location somehow, maybe through Derek, maybe through some app I'd forgotten I'd shared access to years ago. She walked in while I was mid-sentence explaining to Iris why I wasn't interested in the conference speaking opportunity, her heels clicking against the tile floor with that same authoritative rhythm Patricia's always had. "Natalie," she said, not asking, just stating my name like an accusation. I looked up slowly, taking in her appearance. She'd dressed for battle, full makeup, and a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her face was tight with controlled anger, the kind that came from having to maintain composure in public while everything inside was screaming. "Vanessa," I said evenly, "this is Iris Chen. Iris, this is my sister-in-law, Vanessa Hartley." Iris glanced between us, clearly reading the temperature in the room. "I should probably give you two some space." "You don't have to leave," I said. But Iris was already standing, gathering her bag with practiced efficiency. "I'll call you later," she said, squeezing my shoulder once before heading toward the door. "Text me if you need anything." Vanessa slid into the seat Iris had vacated. Uninvited, but expected. She set her purse down with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to arrange whatever she'd come here to say. "That article," she started, her voice low and sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Any idea at all?" I picked up my tea, took a sip, let the silence stretch between us. She wanted me to ask what I'd done, to give her an opening to list my crimes. I didn't give her the satisfaction. "Mom is devastated," Vanessa continued when I didn't respond. "Absolutely devastated. Her friends are calling, asking questions. Everyone knows now that we lost the house, that we've been living in a property owned by you of all people. Do you understand how humiliating that is?" I set my cup down carefully. More humiliating than being slapped at dinner? Her jaw tightened. She was upset. "You provoked her." "By making soup? By ambushing the family with information you'd been hiding for years, by treating us like we were beneath you when we'd welcomed you in." There was that word again. Welcomed. Like tolerance was the same as acceptance. Like allowing me to exist in their spaces was some great gift I should have been grateful for. "You never welcomed me," I said quietly. "You endured me? There's a difference." "That's not true. We included you in everything, every holiday, every dinner, every family event. You were there." "Being present isn't the same as being included, Vanessa. I was there because Derek brought me. And you all made sure I knew every single time that I was his mistake, his lapse in judgment, the girl from nowhere who didn't know which fork to use and wore the wrong shoes and asked the wrong questions. We never said that. You didn't have to say it. It was in every look, every pause, every time Patricia corrected my grammar or Richard asked about my background like he was investigating a crime. It was in the way you talk about Derek's ex-girlfriends, always mentioning their families, their education, their suitability, always within earshot, always making sure I heard." Vanessa's hands had curled into fists on the table. "You're delusional. We were nothing but kind to you. Your kindness had conditions. Be grateful. Be quiet. Don't challenge, don't take up space, accept criticism with a smile, and never ever suggest that maybe the problem wasn't me." The waitress approached, saw the tension at our table, and retreated quickly. Smart woman. "What do you want?" Vanessa asked finally. "Is this about money? Are you trying to extort us? Because if that's what this is, we can negotiate." I almost laughed. Of course she'd reduce it to money. That's what everything was for them. Transactions and negotiations and finding the price point where people would accept being treated poorly. "I don't want your money," I said. "I have my own. That's the whole point you keep missing." "Then what? What is this about? Revenge? Making us pay for some imagined slight? It's about boundaries. Your mother hit me. Your father enabled it. Your brother watched it happen and did nothing. And you're sitting here now, angry at me for the consequences of their actions instead of angry at them for the actions themselves."
She shook her head sharply. You're twisting this, making yourself the victim when you're the one destroying our family. I'm not destroying anything. Your father's poor financial decisions did that. Your mother's violence did that. I'm just refusing to subsidize the illusion anymore. We raised you up, Vanessa hissed, leaning forward. You came from nothing. A dead grandmother and some old lady's house. We gave you access to our world, our connections, our name. And this is how you repay us? There was, again, the fundamental assumption that I should be grateful for their world, their connections, their name, that being allowed into their sphere was worth any price, including my dignity. I didn't come from nothing, I said. I came from a woman who built something real with her own hands and mind, who earned respect instead of demanding it, who taught me that wealth without integrity is just expensive poverty. You think your world is something I should aspire to? A world where a son watches his mother hit his wife and says it's maybe a little much? Where financial crimes are defended and minimized as long as they're committed by the right people? Where reputation matters more than reality? Vanessa's face had gone red. You self-righteous little bitch! The words hung between us, raw and ugly. A man at the next table glanced over, uncomfortable. I kept my voice level. I'm not righteous, Vanessa. I'm just done. Done pretending your family's dysfunction is normal. Done accepting cruelty as love. Done shrinking myself so you can feel bigger. Derek loves you, she said, and there was something desperate in it now. He's my brother, and he loves you. Doesn't that matter? It matters, but it's not enough. Love without respect is just attachment. And Derek has never respected me enough to choose me over you all when it counted. So you're punishing all of us? Making us homeless? You're not homeless. You have 30 days to find housing, which is more warning than most people get when their lives fall apart. And you're not without resources. Richard still has his pension. Patricia has her trust fund. You have Trevor's income. You'll be fine. You just won't be fine in that house, with that view, with that address that lets you feel superior to everyone else. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping loud against the floor. You're going to regret this. When Derek leaves you, when you're alone and you realize what you've thrown away, you're going to regret every bit of this. Maybe, I said, but I doubt it. She grabbed her purse, started to leave, then turned back. One more thing. Mom wants to see you. To talk. Privately. No. You owe her that much. I don't owe her anything. And I definitely don't owe her access to me after what she did. She's your family. No, I said firmly. She's Derek's family. There's a difference. One you all should have remembered before deciding I was expendable. Vanessa left without another word. Heels clicking back across the tile, back out into the rain that had started up again while we were talking. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the adrenaline drain away, leaving me tired but clear-headed. My phone buzzed. A text from Derek. Can we please talk? Just us. No family. I need to understand what you want from me. I stared at the message for a while, trying to figure out if there was an answer that would make this easier. There wasn't. Either he understood why his mother hitting me was unacceptable, or he didn't. Either he saw the years of disrespect and dismissal, or he'd convinced himself it was normal family friction. Either he was willing to build boundaries with his family, or he'd keep choosing their comfort over my safety. The question wasn't what I wanted from him, it was whether he was capable of being the person I needed him to be. And I was starting to suspect the answer was no. I'm staying at a hotel, I typed back. The Heathman, downtown. Room 412. Come by tonight if you want to talk. But Derek, if you come to defend them or to convince me I'm overreacting, don't bother. I'm done with conversations that ask me to minimize what happened. His response came quickly. I'll be there at 7. The afternoon passed in a strange blur of mundane tasks that felt surreal given everything else. I reviewed another licensing proposal. I responded to emails from potential investors. I scheduled a call with my accountant about tax implications for the lease termination. Normal business operations happening alongside the disintegration of my marriage, both things existing simultaneously in the same reality. At 6:30, I was back in my hotel room, standing by the window, looking down at the city lights beginning to glow in the early evening. The Heathman was old Portland money, the kind of place with history and dignity that didn't need to advertise itself. Helen had brought me here once when I was 15 for afternoon tea after a doctor's appointment downtown. We'd sat in the library lounge and she'd told me about the patents, about the money, about the responsibility that came with having resources other people didn't. Money doesn't make you better than anyone, she'd said, stirring sugar into her tea. But it does give you choices. The question is whether you'll use those choices to build something meaningful or just to build walls between you and everyone else. I'd thought about that conversation a lot over the years. The Brennans had chosen walls. Beautiful, expensive walls with perfect landscaping and controlled access, but walls nonetheless. They'd built a fortress of reputation and appearance and called it family, never noticing that fortresses are designed to keep people out. The knock came at 7 exactly. Derek had always been punctual, one of the few things his father had taught him that was actually useful. I opened the door to find him standing there in jeans and a sweater, no suit for once, looking younger and more unsure than I'd seen him in years. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi." I let him in, gestured to the small seating area by the window. He sat on the edge of the chair, hands clasped between his knees, not quite meeting my eyes. "That article," he started, then stopped. "I didn't know about any of it. The patents, the properties, the money. Why didn't you tell me? Would it have mattered?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, would you have treated me differently if you'd known? Would your family have been kinder, or would they have just found different things to criticize? Different ways to remind me I didn't really belong?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking. I'd like to say they would have been different, but honestly, I don't know. Mom has pretty fixed ideas about people. About me specifically, I corrected. She decided who I was the first time we met. Nothing I did after that changed her mind. "She can be difficult," Derek admitted. "But that's just how she is. She's like that with everyone." "No, she isn't. She's lovely to Vanessa's friends. She's charming to your father's colleagues. She's gracious to people she thinks are worth her time. It's specifically people she considers beneath her that she treats like garbage. And she considered me beneath her from day one." He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion I recognize. "So what do you want me to do? Disown my family? Never speak to them again? I want you to see them clearly. To stop making excuses for behavior that's inexcusable. To understand that your mother hit me, and you did nothing, and that's not something I can just move past. I told her it was too much. You said maybe it was a little much. After she had already done it, after the handprint was already on my face. That's not defending me, Derek. That's barely acknowledging what happened." He looked up at me finally, and there were tears in his eyes. "I've never been good at standing up to them. I know that. I've always just tried to keep the peace, to make everyone happy. You can't make everyone happy when one group's happiness requires another person's humiliation. You have to choose. That's what being married means. Choosing your spouse over everyone else when it matters."
And you're saying I didn't choose you. You haven't chosen me once in 4 years. Not when your mother criticized my clothes, not when your father questioned my education, not when Vanessa suggested I'd trapped you into marriage. You'd change the subject or make a joke or find some way to smooth it over without actually addressing the problem. And I let you, because I thought eventually you'd see how hard I was trying, how much I was sacrificing to fit into your family. His hands were shaking slightly. I love you, Natalie. I know I've screwed up, but I do love you. Love isn't enough, I said, and the words hurt coming out, but they were true. Love without respect, without protection, without the willingness to draw boundaries, it's just sentiment. It's not partnership. So you're giving up, just like that? I'm not giving up. I'm refusing to keep setting myself on fire to keep your family warm. There's a difference. We sat in silence for a while, the city humming below us, both of us trying to figure out if there was a path forward, or if we had already passed the point where one existed. What happens to us now? Derek asked finally. I don't know. I think we need some time apart. Real time, not just me staying at a hotel for a few days. Time for you to figure out who you are separate from your family's expectations. Time for me to figure out if I can trust you again. And the house? My parents. The lease termination stands. They knew the terms when your father signed. Actions have consequences, Derek. That's not me being vindictive. That's just reality. Where are they supposed to go? That's not my problem to solve. And the fact that you're asking me to solve it, the fact that you think I should be responsible for making this easier for them, that tells me you still don't understand why I'm angry. He stood up slowly, defeated in a way that might have made me feel guilty if I had any guilt left to give. So that's it then. We're done. I didn't say that. I said we need time. What you do with that time, whether you use it to actually examine your family's behavior or to convince yourself I'm overreacting, that's up to you. He locked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I am sorry about what happened, about not protecting you better. Sorry is a start, I said, but it's not enough. After he left, I ordered room service and ate dinner alone, watching the local news cover some story about urban development that would have interested me more if my own life wasn't currently being redeveloped. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from numbers I'd blocked, from reporters still trying to reach me, from Iris checking in to make sure I was okay. Around 9, an email came through from the managing partner at Richard's investment firm. It was carefully worded, professional, ostensibly reaching out because they'd seen the article and were impressed by my portfolio. But buried in the corporate language was a request. Would I consider meeting to discuss the possibility of investing in their firm? They were looking for capital partners for a new fund they were launching. I read it twice, then checked the signature. Not Richard's name, but his boss. The man who'd overseen the investigation, who'd kept Richard on despite the scrutiny, because firing him would have been admission of institutional failure. They wanted my money. The family that had treated me like I was worthless now wanted access to the resources they'd spent years pretending I didn't have. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. I drafted a response, keeping it brief. Thank you for reaching out. I'm not interested in investment opportunities with your firm at this time. Best wishes for your fund launch. I didn't explain why, didn't mention Richard or the investigation, or the fact that I'd never invest with a company that protected men like him while sacrificing the people under them. Just a polite no, professional, and final. The response came back within 10 minutes. We understand. If circumstances change, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then, in a separate paragraph, almost like an afterthought, please know that Richard Brennan's employment with our firm is currently under review. Recent developments have prompted us to re-evaluate his position. Recent developments. They meant the article. They meant the public exposure of his financial situation, the connection between his foreclosure and his daughter-in-law who'd turned out to have resources he'd never suspected. They meant the optics were bad, and Richard was becoming more liability than asset. I didn't respond to that email. Just closed my laptop and looked out at the city, at all those lights burning in all those buildings where people were living their lives and making their choices and dealing with the consequences of both. Somewhere across town, the Brennan family was probably gathered again, probably strategizing about how to minimize the damage, probably trying to figure out if there was a way to spin this that made them look like victims instead of architects of their own downfall.
I hoped Derek wasn't there. I hoped he'd gone somewhere alone to actually think about what had happened, about his role in it, about the difference between keeping peace and keeping silent while violence occurred. But I suspected he was there, sitting at that table, listening to his mother explain how I'd betrayed them, how I'd always been unstable, how they'd seen signs of this vindictive streak all along. And I suspected he was nodding along, wanting to believe that version because it was easier than accepting the truth. That the truth was they'd driven me away with their own cruelty, that the truth was I'd had power all along and had chosen not to use it until they left me no choice. That the truth was you can only dismiss someone for so long before they stop trying to be seen. My grandmother's voice came back to me, something she'd said years ago when I was crying over some middle school drama I can't even remember now. People will show you who they are, Natalie. Your only job is to believe them the first time. I'd been slow to believe, slow to see, slow to accept that the Brennans were exactly who they appeared to be beneath the polish and the manners and the performance of family values. But I saw it now, clear and complete and impossible to unsee. And that clarity, painful as it was, felt like freedom. Tomorrow would bring more consequences, more calls and emails and probably another confrontation. The 30-day clock was ticking, and the Brennans would actually have to pack, actually leave, actually face the reality that the house they'd thought was theirs belonged to someone else, someone they'd underestimated completely, someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for existing. But tonight, I just sat in my hotel room, high above the city, and felt the solid truth of my own worth settle into my bones. Not because I had money, not because I'd won some battle with Derek's family, but because I'd finally drawn a line between what I would accept and what I wouldn't, and I'd held that line when it mattered most. The rest would figure itself out. Or it wouldn't. Either way, I'd be fine. Because I'd learned something important in that dining room with the burning handprint on my face and the cold soup in front of me. I'd learned that I didn't need their approval to be whole, didn't need their acceptance to have value, didn't need their love to know my own worth. I just needed to remember what my grandmother had taught me all along. That real wealth isn't what you own, it's what you refuse to trade away. And I was done trading pieces of myself for the illusion of belonging somewhere I was never wanted in the first place. The 30 days passed faster than I expected, and slower than the Brennans probably hoped. I watched it from a distance, getting updates from Iris about moving trucks spotted at the Lake Oswego property, hearing through mutual acquaintances that Patricia had taken a sudden extended trip to visit her sister in Santa Fe, learning from Derek's sporadic texts that his parents had found a rental condo in Beaverton, smaller and quieter, and nothing like the estate they were leaving behind. Derek and I met twice more during that month. Once at a coffee shop near my office where we talked in circles for an hour without resolving anything.
Once at the apartment we'd shared, where he packed boxes while I watched, and we both pretended this was temporary, even though we both knew it wasn't. He'd asked me again what I wanted, and I'd given him the same answer. Time. Space. Evidence that he understood why his family's behavior had been unacceptable, and that he wouldn't tolerate it again. He'd nodded like he understood, but his eyes were somewhere else, probably back at that dining room table, probably trying to reconcile the version of his family he'd believed in with the reality I'd forced him to see. Some people can make that reconciliation. Some people can look at the ones they love and acknowledge the harm they've caused and choose different. But Derek had spent 34 years learning to smooth over problems instead of solving them. And I didn't think a month was enough time to unlearn that particular survival skill. The day they moved out, I drove to Lake Oswego one last time, not to supervise or gloat or witness their departure, but because Iris had called to say there was something I needed to see before the new cleaning crew came through. I arrived in the late afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the lawn that was already showing signs of neglect, leaves gathering in corners that would have been cleared immediately just weeks ago. The house was empty, not just of people, but of the careful curation that had made it feel like a showroom instead of a home. Furniture gone, art removed,
even the curtains taken down so that light flooded through windows that had always been carefully filtered. Without all the expensive trappings, it was just rooms and walls and floors. Architecture without personality. Iris met me at the door, her expression unreadable. "They left something for you. In the kitchen." I followed her through the hollow-sounding space, our footsteps echoing in ways they never had when the house was full. On the kitchen counter, the marble surface now showing scratches and stains that had been hidden under decorative bowls and cutting boards, sat a single item. My wine-red scarf. The one I'd worn to that last family dinner. The one I'd left behind when I'd walked out into the rain. It was folded carefully, almost reverently, and tucked underneath was a handwritten note on Patricia's monogrammed stationery. The handwriting was shaky, less controlled than usual. The note was short. "Natalie, you were right about many things. I wish I'd seen them sooner. This doesn't fix what I did, but I want you to know I recognize it was wrong. I hope someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't. The house was always too big anyway. Patricia." I read it twice, looking for the catch, the manipulation, the way she'd twist even an apology into something that centered her feelings over my harm. But it wasn't there. Or, if it was buried so deep I couldn't find it. Just an acknowledgement, brief and inadequate, but more than I had expected to receive. Iris watched me carefully. "What do you want to do with it?" I picked up the scarf, felt the familiar fabric between my fingers, remembered wearing it like armor to family dinners where I'd needed protection I shouldn't have required. Then I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. "Keep the scarf for donations," I said. "Someone else can use it. I don't need it anymore." We walked through the rest of the house together, Iris making notes about repairs and updates, me just observing the space without the Brennans in it. In the dining room, where everything had happened, I stopped and looked at the empty table area, the floor where I'd stood with that handprint burning on my face, the doorway I'd walked through into a different version of my life. "You okay?" Iris asked quietly. I nodded. "Yeah, it's strange seeing it like this, without all the performance. It's just a house. That's all it ever was. They were the ones who made it something else." We finished the walkthrough and stepped back outside into the October air, cooler now as the season shifted toward winter. I locked the door behind us, this house that was mine but had never felt like home, this space I'd bought to save them and would now sell to move forward. "What happens next?" Iris asked as we walked to our cars. "With the property, I mean." "List it. Standard sale. No sentiment, no special terms. Just business." "And with everything else?" I looked back at the house one more time, at the perfect exterior that had hidden so much dysfunction, at the windows that no longer had anyone watching through them to make sure appearances were maintained. "I keep building," I said. "The life I actually want, instead of the one I thought I was supposed to want." 3 months later, I was standing in a different space entirely, a commercial building in Portland's Pearl District, all exposed brick and high ceilings and natural light that didn't need filtering. The sign outside read Worth Development and Consulting, named after my grandmother, named after what mattered. Inside, we'd created offices for the small team I'd assembled, Iris handling property acquisitions, 2 associates managing patent licensing, a legal advisor who specialized in intellectual property, and me, finally visible, finally using my real name on business that was actually mine. The Lake Oswego house had sold in 2 weeks, bought by a young family who'd walked through and immediately started planning where their kids' toys would go, how they'd use the formal dining room for chaotic family dinners, how they'd let the lawn grow a little wild with play. The transaction had been straightforward, professional, unmarked by history I was glad to let go of. Derek and I had signed divorce papers in February. Not contentious, just sad, sitting across from each other in a lawyer's office and acknowledging that some things couldn't be repaired no matter how much time you gave them. He'd tried, in his way, joined a therapy group for adult children of difficult parents, set some boundaries with Patricia that lasted about 6 weeks before eroding under her persistent need to be involved in every aspect of his life. He wanted me to see the effort, to give him credit for trying, and I had. But trying wasn't the same as succeeding, and I couldn't build a marriage on good intentions that never translated to actual change. We'd parted as amicably as two people could when one of them had watched the other get hit and said it was maybe a little much. He'd kept the apartment, I'd kept everything else. Fair seemed like the wrong word, but it was what it was. Patricia had sent flowers after the divorce was finalized, expensive ones, arranged by someone who understood symbolic apology. The card said simply, "I'm sorry for my part in this." No expectation of response, no request for contact, just an acknowledgement that landed 3 months too late to change anything, but was still more than I had expected to receive. I donated those flowers to a nursing home and moved on. Now, standing in my office with papers spread across the desk and spring sunlight warming the brick walls, I was working on something that felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. A partnership with the medical equipment manufacturer developing new imaging technology based on Helen's original patents, but updated for modern applications. A property investment in Northeast Portland that would create affordable live workspaces for artists and small business owners. A mentorship program for women in STEM fields who were trying to navigate careers in male-dominated industries. Real work. Meaningful work. Work that used what I had to build something that mattered instead of just accumulating more. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief. "Hi, Natalie. This is Cole. I know I don't have the right to reach out, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing it. For not saying anything. You deserved better from all of us. I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a while, surprised by it, uncertain what to do with an apology from the brother-in-law who'd made jokes about my poverty while I'd been quietly paying their parents' mortgage. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it sit unread and unacknowledged the way so many of my attempts at connection had been dismissed by his family.
But another part of me, the part that Helen had raised to be fair, even when other people weren't, knew that growth had to start somewhere. I typed back carefully, "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I'm doing well. I hope you are too." His response came quickly. "I'm working on it. For what it's worth, that whole thing made me look at a lot of stuff differently. About our family, about how we treated people. I'm trying to be better." "That's all any of us can do," I sent back. "Try to be better than we were." We didn't exchange numbers or make plans to meet, just that brief exchange. Acknowledgement passing between two people who'd been connected by marriage and were now connected only by shared history and the possibility of growth. It was enough. The following week, I was invited to speak at a conference on women and property investment, the same one I'd turned down months ago when I was still deciding how visible I wanted to be. This time, I said yes. Not because I needed the platform or wanted the attention, but because I remembered being a quiet girl in a thrift store coat who thought having money meant you had to hide it, and I wanted other women to know there was a different way. The speech I gave wasn't about revenge or justice or making anyone pay for their mistakes. It was about building something real with resources you'd earned, about honoring the people who'd believed in you when others didn't, about knowing your worth regardless of who tried to convince you otherwise. I talked about Helen, about her quiet brilliance and her patient teaching and her insistence that wealth was responsibility, not status. I talked about the importance of contracts and boundaries and walking away from situations that required you to diminish yourself. I didn't mention the Brennans by name. Didn't need to. The story was bigger than them. Bigger than one family's dysfunction, bigger than one slap at one dinner table. It was about all the small ways people tried to make you smaller and all the ways you could choose not to shrink. The response was overwhelming. Women approached me after, sharing their own stories of being underestimated, dismissed, told they weren't enough by people who needed them to be less. Some cried. Some laughed. All of them understood what it meant to finally take up space after years of apologizing for existing. That evening, I walked through Portland's Japanese garden, a place Helen had brought me countless times growing up. The cherry blossoms were just starting to bloom, pale pink against the dark branches, beautiful in their brief perfection. I sat on a bench overlooking the koi pond, watching the fish move through clear water, and felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for as long as I could remember. Peace, maybe. Or just the absence of constant tension. The feeling of not having to perform or prove or defend. Just existing. Fully present, taking up exactly the amount of space I needed without apology. My phone buzzed with an email from Margaret Hollis at the Portland Business Journal. She was following up on the original article, wanted to do a feature on Worth Development's first year. I wrote back saying yes, we could schedule something next month. No hesitation this time. No wondering if visibility was worth the vulnerability. Just acknowledgement that this was my work, my company, my story to tell. As the sun started to set, casting golden light across the garden, I thought about that last family dinner. About standing in that kitchen making soup that would never be good enough, about the slap that had finally broken through years of accumulated silence, about walking out into the rain and feeling something shift inside me that couldn't shift back. People often asked if I regretted how it ended, if I wished I'd handled things differently, been more patient, given them more chances. The answer was complicated. I regretted that it had to end that way, regretted that Derek's family had been so committed to their dysfunction that growth wasn't possible without destruction, regretted that sometimes the only way to save yourself was to walk away from people you'd hoped would choose you. But I didn't regret walking away. Didn't regret buying that house, or terminating that lease, or finally using the resources I'd hidden to draw boundaries I should have drawn years earlier. Didn't regret the divorce, or the visibility, or the choice to build something new instead of trying to fix something that had been broken from the start. The real withdrawal hadn't been the house or the money or even my presence in their lives. It had been my silence, my tolerance, my willingness to accept cruelty as love because I was so desperate to belong somewhere. I'd withdrawn all of that, pulled it back from people who'd never valued it. And what I'd found underneath was something solid and real and mine. Not inherited from Helen, though she taught me how to see it. Not given by Derek, though he'd been part of the journey. Not earned through the Brennans' approval, though they'd inadvertently taught me what I wouldn't accept. Just me. The person I'd been before I learned to make myself smaller. The girl who'd drawn up business plans in a blue notebook and believed that kindness and success could coexist. The woman who'd inherited not just money, but values. Not just property, but purpose. Not just resources, but responsibility to use them well. I stood from the bench as the garden's closing time approached, walking slowly back through paths Helen and I had walked together. At the entrance, I paused and looked back one more time at the peaceful space we'd shared, at the beauty that existed without performance, at the careful cultivation that enhanced rather than controlled nature. That's what I was building now. A life that enhanced rather than controlled. Relationships based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. Work that contributed rather than just accumulated. Space that welcomed rather than excluded. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was. There were still hard days and complicated choices and moments when I wondered if I'd made the right call. But even on those days, even in those moments, I never wished I was back in that dining room, back in that marriage, back in that version of myself who believed she had to earn the right to exist. Some withdrawals are financial, some are emotional, some are just the simple act of reclaiming yourself from people who never should have had access to you in the first place. Mine had been all three, and I'd never felt wealthier. As I drove home through Portland's evening streets, past the Pearl District office that bore my grandmother's name, past the Alberta Arts neighborhood where I'd first learned to live alone, past all the landmarks of a life I'd built quietly and was now living openly, I thought about salt. How it enhances flavor when used properly, how it preserves things worth keeping, how too much ruins everything it touches, how the absence of it isn't a flaw, but sometimes exactly what's needed for something to be itself. The soup was fine, had always been fine. The problem was never the seasoning.
It was the people tasting it who needed everything to be wrong so they could feel right. I was done cooking for people who decided in advance they wouldn't like what I made, done adjusting and apologizing and trying to fix problems that existed only in their need to find fault. Now I was cooking for myself, for people who appreciated the effort, for a life that tasted exactly how I wanted it to, seasoned with choices I'd made consciously, enhanced by relationships I'd built carefully, preserved by boundaries I maintained consistently. And if that wasn't to everyone's taste, well, they could make their own soup. I parked outside my new apartment, a place I'd chosen myself with light I liked and space that felt right. Upstairs, Helen's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter next to her fountain pen, both of them reminders of what mattered: building something real, maintaining integrity, knowing your worth regardless of who tried to convince you otherwise.
Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, and probably a few more awkward encounters with people from that old life. But tonight, I made myself dinner in my own kitchen, eating slowly and tasting every bite, grateful for the simple freedom of not having to explain or defend or apologize for taking up space in my own life. The withdrawal was complete, not just of assets or property or presence, but of the fundamental belief that I needed anyone's permission to be myself. And what I'd deposited in place of all that? Something worth infinitely more. The certainty that I was enough, exactly as I was. Salt or no salt. Approval or no approval. Performance or no performance. Just me. Finally. Completely. Unapologetically. And that was worth more than any estate in Lake Oswego could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.